Mark Dion here this evening to talk specifically about his field work. I know that a lot of you are asking what is that, and you are going to have a presentation that tells you exactly what that is. We'll then hand it over to our very own curator, Rene Morales, who has been a curator at PAMM for quite a number of years and worked with Mark on an exhibition in 2011 that displayed an incredible work. Everybody's been asking tonight, what is that yellow truck? And so tonight you will find out what exactly that is. Unscripted Harbour would not happen without the support of Harbour. So thank you so much for hosting these talks. This venue is absolutely beautiful. We love it here. Thank you to Harbour. We really appreciate everything you do for us. And then my last shout out goes to Christy Gast, who is one of our winners. She was also the person who led us to Mark. She's on our advisory team, and when I phone them up and I say, who should we get? She said, what about Mark? And I said, you know him? And I said, get him. So I basically harassed her until we finally persuaded Mark to come down. So thank you very much for being here. I'm not going to tell you too much about Mark because he speaks so beautifully and he does teach, and so I feel like this is going to be one of those talks where we just we leave it to the pros. So thank you again to everybody who has made this talk happen tonight, and welcome. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much. So our format tonight is going to be extremely informal, and I think that one of the reasons for that is that Rene and I have worked together very closely on a number of different projects, and it's, I think, an interesting opportunity where we can follow the genesis of a work. So how do things actually happen, I think is an interesting question. If you're looking at artists who don't have studios, I'm not an artist who has a studio. I don't make things in the studio. I've never made something that didn't have a place to go already. It's just not my way. And so what I think about in terms of my working method is very much, there's always a field work element to it. I think maybe my process as an artist is a little bit akin to something like a corporate troubleshooter. So you're invited to go into a place, and there's something about the place that people want to do, want to improve, they know that something is not quite working or something needs to be pointed out, but they don't know exactly what that is. So they need to bring an outside set of eyes. And very often I function as that outside set of eyes because my work is entirely married to the notion of place. So I'm brought into a location, a site, and site can mean a lot of different things. Site can be the architectural peculiarities of a building. Site can be the social history, the social culture of a location, its specific social history. Site can also relate to the zeitgeist of what's going on at the time. And so when Rene invited me to Miami to work on the project that we did together at the Miami Art Museum, it was very much this question of what makes sense in terms of my, when I arrive, I don't come completely empty. I don't come with nothing. I bring my suitcase of concerns. And those concerns are largely questions about the culture of nature. That's really what my focus is as an artist, not so much nature per se, but really ideas about nature. And so what does that mean for arriving here in South Florida, and which I think is, for me, one of the most fascinating contexts. It's really kind of the front line of what's happening in terms of culture and nature at the moment. Do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Well, let's go a little further into what you mean by the culture of nature, and maybe we can dive in and talk about the culture of nature here and the kind of the findings that you worked into the project for MAM.
Okay. So the project that we're talking about is the piece that is at the Miami Art Museum now, and I think everyone here received the invitation, which shows the work. It's the very large yellow truck, which of course is not a truck at all. It's a sculpture. It's actually made of MDF. It was made by the exceptional crew behind the scenes of at the Miami Art Museum. So the ignition key has never been turned on. There is no engine to start over. It's all made of wood and other materials. So that's the work we're really addressing. And so when I think about what the culture of nature is, I'm not really an artist who's interested in, say, plants and animals and natural landscapes, natural places, as much as I'm interested in our cultural ideas that shape the fate of those things, that really in some way create our intellectual philosophical discourse. So I always say I'm not so much interested in nature, but really in ideas about nature. And those ideas, which come from a variety of different traditions, drastically shape our attitudes toward the natural world. So arriving here, you have on one hand this one of the greatest expressions of wildlife in the world, which is of course the Everglades and the water surrounding and the ocean here, and this kind of extraordinary place where animals are sort of funneled in, where there are so many expressions of tropical, of neotropical life that make their only appearance in North America, in Miami, and you have all these endemic organisms that are here. So this is kind of an extraordinary place for anyone who's interested in those things. You also have people who want to interact and to be in a relationship with that, although sometimes that being close to that, having that immediate coexistence with nature also destroys it. So there's a lot of the kind of problems that we're having are, in some way, I think Miami is maybe ahead of the game in terms of experiencing these problems that other places are going to be experiencing increasingly as population grows, as urbanization expands, as wild places shrink.
So let me step back a little bit and describe the project that we worked on together. It's called the South Florida Wildlife Rescue Unit, and it was commissioned for Miami Art Museum for a specific gallery. And it consists of the big yellow truck that appears in the Evite again. But there are other components too, which are extremely important. The other components are actually not on view right now at the galleries. The truck is. Mark conceived the truck as the kind of vehicle that would be used by an agency that does not exist. An agency that is official. They have their official emblem, their uniforms, all the equipment that one would need to swoop into particularly endangered areas of the Everglades and rescue plants and animals. So in a way, it's a materialization of a dream that does not but should exist. And efforts that, at the same time, it's reflective of real efforts, more unofficial, underground efforts that Mark actually encountered while he was doing research here, in terms of various people who are actually going out there and studying and doing what they can in a kind of grassroots way for this incredible ecosystem. And in fact, if you look at the history of the Everglades, some of the most important and effective efforts have been grassroots and completely disassociated from broader scale governmental efforts. And then, so that was the truck. That was what you saw when you immediately came into the space. The second component, it was the trucks and the uniforms. So the uniforms for this South Florida Wildlife Rescue Unit team together. And then the second component was a series of photographs, which Mark found. I believe all of them were from, no, not all of them, but most of them were from the History, what is now History Miami, which has a very rich collection, a rich archive of 19th century photographs. And these were images of different kinds of gatherers, people who have gathered, people who are in the process of gathering plants, mainly plants, from the Everglades, either for research purposes, for scientific purposes, or for commercial purposes. Of course, the Everglades, one of the really tragic aspects of Everglades history involves people who have poachers, and the poaching in particular bird feathers and of important and endangered plants like orchids, etc. And then the last component since I've been talking a lot, maybe Mark, I'll hand it over to you, but involved coming to a vitrine, which was designed very specifically by Mark to have the look of kind of an old-fashioned history museum. We used real glass, we didn't use plexi, and it was varnished and stained so that it has this kind of antique quality. So Mark, maybe you can talk a little bit about the contents of this.
Yes, so when I'm coming and trying to understand a place and its relationship to nature, very often what I do is do a little research, go back and find who are some of these linchpin figures in that history. And one of the people that I was very drawn to was Henry Perrine. And you all know the name because there are streets named after Perrine. And I'm sorry? Yeah, and there's a town named after him. And Perrine was this absolutely fascinating character. I mean, you couldn't really make up. His story is so eccentric and interesting, you couldn't really make it up. So he was a physician, I believe, in Illinois. He studied medicine, and he became a pharmacist. One day he was mixing up, his assistant was mixing up some arsenic for a medicine, and the assistant left the room. Perrine came and drank the glass down thinking it was water, and had a near-death experience, and was for the rest of his life debilitated in a very unusual way. He could not withstand cold. So anytime there was cold, he would have an attack. He would be, bedridden for days and days and days. So he increasingly, for most of his life, moved further and further and further south. Eventually, he became the consul for the Yucatan, for the government in Mexico in Yucatan, and there he became extremely obsessed with botany, and also believed that he was one of the first people to recognize the agricultural potential of plants in Florida. So to recognize what an agricultural juggernaut Florida had the potential to be by introducing plants from other regions. So Perrine is, for instance, the person who brought us the poinsettia, right? That was a plant that he naturalized into the country. And so that got me involved in looking into the history of plant collectors, looking into all of this kind of remarkable stuff. And working here with the university, with the botanical collection, working with the Fairchild, who was another sponsor of the project, and who brought me a lot to thinking about David Fairchild and his importance in the history of botany here. And while I was at the Fairchild, I met these young botanists who would actually go to places that were being developed in the middle of the night, climb over the construction fences, dig out, survey the area, dig out all the rare plants that were in the area before they got bulldozed, rescue those, and put them somewhere else. So that was the entire inspiration for this truck, was imagining some way to formalize that activity that these botany ninjas were doing on their own, and so that for me became, in a way, what I'm doing when I come to a place is looking for the thread. I want to find that thread there's something going on in a place that resonates, that's important, that's interesting. And sometimes it takes a long time to actually find what that thing is. And so my methodology is doing this kind of historical research, spending a lot of time in places, talking to contemporary practitioners. And in this case, that thread came from overhearing these two young botanists talk about this secret practice that they had, trespassing, digging up plants that were going to go under the bulldozer in spaces that were immediately being developed. So that really seemed to be something very urgent here. So I wanted to take that and fantasize about what would that look like if we could take it to the next level, as a way of also speaking about this issue as an important issue for what the future of the natural world is going to be here. And so that is, my work always has a kind of political dimension, but I don't go at things with the most straightforward way. I always want there to exist with a level of complexity and a level of that is just not, I'm not really interested in preaching to people, but I want there to be a kind of very deep hook for the viewer. So I also want the piece to have a lot of presence, and I want it to have a lot of beauty.
So
you know what? Okay. Well,
Well, just backing up a little bit, again to Perrine and the vitrine. Henry Perrine went out to the Everglades, one of the very, very earliest, very first people to live there aside from Native Americans who had already been in that area. We're talking about the 1820s, 1830s, I believe, so very early. And he did his research there, and he was actually killed during the Seminole Wars. Probably by the Seminoles, everything was, all of his possessions were burnt down. It's a very dramatic story, and nothing really survived. So what Mark created, as far as the contents of this vitrine, are artifacts, false artifacts, as if this spoon, this burnt spoon, had survived from the fire, and also principally a book called a herbarium, an herbarium. Herbarium is a book in which you press plants, does everyone kind of have a sense of what it is? It's a book filled with preserved plants, and of course this is an interesting kind of object because it marries the book, the most prominent symbol that one can think of knowledge, with nature. So it really kind of sums, the herbarium really kind of sums up what is at the heart of Mark's project, the question of, not of nature, but of our knowledge of nature and how it's been constructed.
So when I want to explain this, so now you get a sense of the process. I come here, I do a lot of research, I snoop around, I talk to a lot of people, I get excited about the place, I start to investigate, I come to Rene with a proposal, we go over it, sense, we build the work, and it exists, right? End of story? No. Because sometimes these stories spin off into another degree, right? So so from this I had this notion of this vehicle that could exist in the world, but it's a fantasy. It's a work that exists only on a discursive level. Then I thought, why couldn't I just make that real in some way? Why couldn't I take it to the next step? And so that brings me to the city of Houston, which you see behind you. This is the city of Houston, and this is the Buffalo Bayou, which is the river that goes through Houston. It's one of probably the most neglected urban waterways in any city. You could easily live and thrive in Houston without ever really acknowledging that there's a river that goes through it. And of course, the river is the reason for Houston to be there, right? Houston comes about because Galveston has too many hurricanes. People move upriver and end up in Houston, forming their city around the Buffalo Bayou. The Buffalo Bayou now is hidden, neglected, but there is a conservation organization there that's very interested in the historical ecology of the Buffalo Bayou. So they wanted me to help them come up with something that was a useful tool for their practices. So, oh, look, that works. So I took that idea of the truck and actually got a real truck. And so, when you're working with wildlife restoration projects, you can say make a plant a tree planting day, right? And you'll get maybe 5 or 6 volunteers. You can have a public education day, and you'll get 2 or 3 volunteers. You can have an invasive plant eradication day. You'll have 40 or 50 people. People love to get rid of nuisance plants. So I wanted to make something that had that aspect to it. So this is actually a functioning tool. This is the Buffalo Bayou Invasive Plant Eradication Unit. At the same time, I want to also make fun of a very strange social context in Texas, where they tend to be very aggressive and macho, and especially when it relates to what they perceive as invasive or alien. So at the same time, I want this piece to have to not hide the more pernicious aspects of that there's some kind of, I think, a very kind of dubious ideology embedded in this as well. So this is my invasive plant eradication unit. It functions as the headquarters for these projects. So when they say we're going to do an invasive plant eradication activity, we go to a particular site. Inside the truck, it's completely equipped with all of the stuff that people need to do this, so shovels and rakes and all kinds of things like that. It's also where the people keep their lunch. It's where they have their orientation meeting. It's where they're taught how to use a machete so they don't cut their toes off. Oops, sorry about that.
It's kind of amazing how much it looks like the fictitious version.
It does.
At PAMM.
Because that was in many ways that really prepared me. And also, you know, in every war, there's of course a practical war, and there's a propaganda war. So this also goes to street fairs and things like that. Why does Houston have an invasive plant problem? Because people who are upriver in Buffalo Bayou have beautiful palatial homes with amazing gardens, which they plant with non-native species. And so those seeds get into the river, drift down, and then they invade the lower part, the lower regions of the river, and cause all sorts of problems. So there are things that are coming from Asia and South America and Europe that are seeding downriver and destroying what's already a pretty fragile native ecology that's on the ropes. So we're also using this to try to convince people not to do that. And with many of my projects, I also have these kind of field guides, which function in the kind of language of the field guide. You know, I'm very much influenced by the sort of aesthetics of the campfire girls and the Boy Scouts and people like that. So that these try to discuss the work as an artwork, which is not always an easy sell, but also try to discuss some of the practical issues of what's at stake in projects like this. So I want them to be sexy, they have to be really attractive, they have to function as art, but in some cases, it's really interesting to try to make that additional push to make it into something that's not merely discursive, but actually has an active role in some of these issues.
Great, yeah. Well, let's go on to the next project.
Okay, let's see what I have next. Oh, wait, I'm going to go the other way. Close your eyes for a minute while I back up.
This is such a good one.
Yeah.
That
I'm going to go back to...
Great.
No, back. Okay, so here we go. That's kind of the low-tech solution to a high-tech problem. And often, you know, as I said, I'm invited to come into a place and try to look and see things with different eyes. So this is a project that was done in Essen, Germany. And so Essen was the cultural capital of Europe some years ago. I visited Essen on the most bitterly cold February day you can imagine. And so I wanted a site that was based on where the land and the water met, and we went and were right on the edge of a marina, which was of course abandoned during the winter. Everything was iced over, but it was filled with water birds. And I was freezing, and there was a small temporary house, like a construction house, and there was smoke coming out of the roof. And my guide said, we can go in here, we can get a cup of coffee. So this is a really desolate landscape. We open this door, and suddenly you hear these boisterous voices. And you walk in, and there are all these big men, you know, just like giant fingers, and they're drinking schnapps and beer. This is 9 in the morning. And there's a bar there, and there's, you know, pin-up girls on the wall behind the bar. The walls of this place are like caramel colored from years of cigarette smoke. You know, the cigarette smoke is just pouring out, and so is the testosterone. And so it's loud and boisterous, and I'm thinking, what in the world is this place? And they said, oh, well, this is the Fisherman's Club. And I said, the Fisherman's Club, when does fishing season open? And I said, oh, in May. And so I thought, wow, here's like, you know, 14 big guys getting together in this desolate place and having the time of their lives because they have this discourse around fish, around, you know, that they have some relationship to animals. And this is obviously like what's driving them and what they're talking about, and they're deeply passionate about this. So I thought, okay, this is clearly something interesting. This is the thread in this place. And so, but I wanted to make a club like that too, you know, but I'm not really interested in kind of recapitulating this kind of locker room macho environment. I wanted to make a club like that for dandies, right? So, for more gentle folk. So I found this abandoned oxygen. This is a tank that used to pump oxygen into the sewage treatment plant. And I worked with the technicians, the metal workers at the sewage treatment plant, to retrofit this with a tower and a little hobbit door. And we opened up these windows onto the marina, and there this became the Amateur Ornithologist Club. So the Amateur Ornithologist Clubhouse is for gentle folk to come in and enjoy the bird watching and get introduced into the culture of birds. So there's lots of books about birds. There's lots of images about birds. You can see there's a frieze of names of people who've done a lot for birds. So people like Audubon and Roger Torrey Peterson and Marjorie Stoneham Douglas. It's very cozy and it really welcomes you in. There's optics there, there's recording equipment there.
No smoking, right?
Oh no, there's smoking. There's an attendant there who helps keep track of all the birds that people see and also make sure that things are not stolen. And there's watercolors in case you want to draw birds. And of course, clubs are all about drinking and smoking. So you can drink there, but you can only drink Grey Goose or Famous Grouse, Cockspur, Wild Turkey, Parrot Bay, rum. And of course, you can smoke, but you can only smoke larks. Okay. So, and of course, sorry, some of these are flipped, but. And of course, Germany has just amazing kitsch, right? And so we took advantage of all of that as well. That one. Oh, there we go. And so everything in this house is dedicated to the culture of birds. Oops. Very nice of you to save. So continuing with that bird theme, and moving on now to the city of Folkestone. Folkestone is a city it's on the English Channel. On a good day, you can easily see France, right? And Folkestone was, at one time, this incredibly wealthy, beautiful retreat. This is before people from Britain went to Ibiza instead of places like Folkestone. And so wealthy, well-known people like Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells had houses here. This is where the Prince of Wales would take his mistress. There was a promenade there. And of course, like many seaside towns, it's fallen on much harder times in the 20th century. So, but the architecture, the views, the beaches themselves still exist. So there's a sculpture triennial there, which tries to bring people's attention back to the idea of that this is a great city. This has a lot of cultural treasures. So I was invited to come, and I'm also from a seaside town. I'm from New Bedford, Massachusetts, a town which also had has perhaps fallen in many ways from its previous glory. But so I'm interested in seeing what are the differences between my seaside experience and Folkestone. And the first thing I noticed is that people hate gulls, right? They just can't stand gulls. And so, and people hate gulls because some people love gulls too much, right? Those people feed the gulls. Gulls are of course, incredibly intelligent birds. They have a very flexible, they have flexible behavior. They learn and they pass on that learning. And so, there's a gull in Folkestone who knows how to use the door at Tesco's and can use the automatic door to walk in, grab a packet of what we would call potato chips, what they call crisps, and drags it out, and all the gulls eat those together. And gulls will, if you're coming out of the fish and chip shop on Friday, gulls will come over your shoulder and knock the French fries onto the ground, and they'll all come in and eat them. Sounds like they're laughing at you, but they're not. And so what gulls have is really a PR problem, right? So what gulls really need is oh, what's going on? Doesn't this always happen? All right, let's try. I know. I used to only show slides, and this is why. Oh, okay, now that's the other way. Now, can we go the other way? There we go. Try that. Oh, it's really frustrating. There we go. Oh, what did you just give me? Try again. Ah, there we go. So what gulls need is a mobile gull appreciation unit. So the mobile gull appreciation unit travels around the city of Folkestone. What were you using? That? Oh. And so, and my gull enthusiasts who've all been trained, and while it's not possible to speak gull, it's very possible to learn gull. So you can learn very clearly. Gulls are one of the birds that have been studied by ethologists really since before the Second World War. And so we know a lot about what gulls are saying and what they're doing and what their movements are. So we try to teach people. Go ahead, please. So we travel around to different gull hotspots. And what we found was, I mean, much to our surprise, that people actually don't hate gulls. In fact, the more people we encountered, the more we realized there's more people who love gulls than people who hate gulls. And the people who hate gulls are just this incredibly crabby minority, like a certain party we know, who are just kind of ruin everything for everyone else, right? And so we ended up becoming a clearinghouse for positive stories about gulls, for stories where people had very strong, intimate relationships with gulls. And of course, we also had a field guide for that, which would teach you some aspects of gull language and also help you to identify, this is kind of a gull hotspot for Britain. So there's a lot of gulls who only show up here. A lot of the Mediterranean gulls, this is kind of one of the only places that they'll actually show up in Britain or will be easy to see. So these are kind of projects that maybe have, they all evolve in the same way as an encounter with place. And I think that that's really my raw material as an artist is being able to come someplace and try to reflect on what is the situation of nature, what is the thing there that is engaging for local people that maybe is slightly different there. Like people in Folkestone don't know that they have different attitude towards gulls than many other places. For them, that's just the attitude towards gulls. So sometimes bringing in that outside set of eyes is really helpful in identifying things that make these places very distinct.
Well, does anyone have any questions before we? Yes.
That's a good question. Well, I think, with all of these projects, and a lot of these projects are part of a very kind of rich festival culture that we don't really have so much in the States. So for example, there are these famous exhibitions in Europe, like the Venice Biennale, the sculpture project in Munster, Documenta, those kinds of projects, and I pretty much have done them all. And I think that that's something that they have in Europe, which is part of, I think, what it means to be in a society that wants to foster a particular kind of culture, that we just don't have that. Everything here is very laissez-faire. So there are other people can make things happen, but that doesn't exist in the same way. So, but cities like Folkestone realize that when you do a festival like that, you get more money out of it than you put into it, because you have an enormous and well-heeled group of people who come to see this exhibition, who spend time. The exhibition, an exhibition like Documenta in a tiny town like Kassel, Documenta was almost impossible to see in 4 days. So you're now bringing people to a city like Kassel where they have to spend at least 4 or 5 days. They have to buy tickets, they have to buy dinners, they'll buy catalogs. So it's not like this money is thrown into a black hole either. That it's really works with a broader economic model. So that's one of the ways that I make money and survive on these things. But also I'm a very diverse artist. I make drawings, I make prints, I make work for galleries. So I couldn't survive, say, just doing this, for instance. Right.
District or whatever it is in Europe,
Yeah. Well, you know, sometimes these are set up as...
More pragmatic,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
who would contact you? Who would reach out to you
Well,
to
you know, I think what makes these things work is that they have an extremely capable professional group of curators who, you know, so one of the difficult things is, for instance, here when you do public art, you have this huge community involvement which has positive things and negative things, right? Whereas in Europe, they hire very good curators and they trust that they know what they're doing, right? And so the point of art isn't necessarily to make everyone happy. So if you go about it from the community road, where that's your goal is to make everyone happy, you're not going to make very good art. So I think, you know, what makes these things interesting for me is that they are done on a very high level.
One of my favorite projects of yours is the Den, and I'm wondering if you could just sort of walk through how that came to be and your thinking behind that.
Okay, well, I think this is a really interesting example. I don't have a picture of the Den, sadly, on this. The Den is a project which has an unusual client like this. The client for the Den is the Department of Transportation. So it's hard to imagine the Department of Transportation in the United States supporting innovative contemporary art. But I'll tell you how it happened. So, of course, everyone knows Norway is now very oil rich. So they have made it, they've been very conscious about spreading that oil wealth around in a kind of remarkably enlightened way. So because of that wealth, you have new hospitals, new universities, new opera houses, new roads, new ports, new airports. So that all of that is feeding into this interesting situation. So the roads in Norway were so treacherous that really you couldn't even get from Oslo to Bergen in the wintertime. So because they went over mountain passes. And what they did was they created this whole series of tunnels. It's a remarkable feat of engineering. Some of these tunnels, there's one tunnel that's more than 22 kilometers long. So that's an enormous, but because of that, they don't need these roads that go over the mountains, but the roads that go over the mountains are beautiful. And if something ever happens to the tunnels, they know they need them. So they decided to turn those roads into a tourist route. And so these roads do go over some of the most stunningly beautiful landscape I've ever seen, with glaciers and glacial pools and these amazing tundras. And so they said, well, let's sweeten the deal, and we'll add architecture projects into this. So everything that would normally be infrastructure for a road, like a rest stop or scenic overlook, we'll invite the most challenging, forward-thinking young architects to design those. And they did that for 10 years, and it was tremendously popular. People came from all over the world to see some of these architectural projects that were very compelling, using new technologies. I mean, they were just kind of great. And so after 10 years, they said, okay, now let's add the artworks. So they commissioned Louise Bourgeois, Fischli and Weiss, and myself to do projects. So I found this one area that was an incredibly remote landscape. And I was really interested in how, you know, this is a landscape where nature looks like it's all here, but it's not quite all there. We don't have all the parts because we've killed all the wolves and the bears. So I wanted to make something that kind of acknowledged that there's always the chance that the bears can come back and the wolves can come back. So you snake through a long pathway over a fragile tundra, and then you find yourself at an opening that you have to stoop down, or maybe I don't have to stoop down, but some of you will have to stoop down. And you walk down about 20 feet of dark corridor, and suddenly you find yourself in a very large opening, and you are looking at a diorama. And the diorama is the interior of a cave full of stalactites and stalagmites and beautiful shiny walls with glistening with what looks like minerals. It's actually glitter, but and then there's a pile of material culture, debris, starting at the bottom with Paleolithic and Neolithic axe heads and fish hooks, and then going up to the beginnings of agriculture, fragments from Roman and Greek society, going up through Vikings, agricultural 18th century stuff, 19th century stuff, to iPads and computers, And on top of that is a very large sleeping bear. So this bear is just sleeping on the mess of our material culture, just waiting to come back, just waiting to wake up. Once we go, it can all come back. So it's a very fanciful, it plays a lot with the mythology in the North, it plays a lot with what's missing in this environmental puzzle, and it's meant to be a very kind of delightful encounter that also has a melancholy aspect to it. So, and that's how I want my work to function, you know, to be kind of a surprise. I actually don't really care if people see it as art or not, you know. I just want them to have an interesting experience. So it's really important for me that, you know, sometimes that word art can shut things down. When you come across this, it's kind of hard not to be engaged. But if we had a label outside that called it an artwork, that would really, for a lot of people, I think, close doors. And so that's always a problem. Yeah.
At the start of this talk, you spoke about your concerns. And so looking at obviously a lot of the work you do, one would deduce from this that you obviously care a lot about the environment. Can you talk a little bit about your concerns in general? I mean, is your artwork intended to have some kind of a social tone to it?
I think it always does, but I think that that's very complex. And I don't necessarily always try to focus on each individual work, but I think about my work as a kind of lifelong practice. And some of those, some works, some sculptures, some drawings, some photographs, some outdoor works hit the nail very well, and others don't in a way. But I don't, some of them are really focusing on the core concerns, but then there's a lot of them that are more concerns on the periphery. So in thinking about the culture of nature, for example, I work a lot with museums that are kind of where you get the official story of what gets to be called nature at a particular time for a particular group of people. So, in working on museums, you get involved with the history of collecting. So I've done a lot of projects where I'm helping museums arrange their collections. So that's not really core to my concern, but it's tangential, but it's still something very important and very interesting to me. And I think the projects I've done around that have been very compelling. Yes.
You have a lifelong dream about a project that hasn't come to pass yet, and you're saying, oh, only someone came to me with this?
You know, I started off working a lot in Central America, working with zoos and wildlife conservation organizations, and I kind of hope that I get back around to that, and to see if somehow I can return to that kind of context, to working on, you know, I helped build a visitor center for a park. I worked on a sign system for a zoo in Belize. So the idea of maybe getting back to that at some point would be something really interesting to me, to like kind of go back now with 30 years more experience than when I did that.
Well, what is interesting about that kind of project is that the commissioning entity is not necessarily an art institution?
I think that that's part of it, and also that, you know, I mean, what's interesting to me about the works that I do outside is that I can't make assumptions about the audience in a way that, you know, a lot of the works I do, if I make a work in a museum or gallery, which is what I mostly do, I can make a lot of assumptions about who comes through that door. I can make sort of assumptions about their education, about their interests, but when you're making work out of that context, you can't. And so I always find that a very, really fascinating idea of how, you know, how work that is challenging and complex aesthetically can speak to people who don't come to it with a kind of, with a formal aesthetic education.
Well, is this still working?
Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting, and I think it really starts getting to the heart of what this discussion was initially, conceived as a focus on your field work, the work that you do in the field, which I don't know what we mean by that exactly. Does that mean in the field outside of the art world? Perhaps that's one way to read it. But it's interesting to think about all the publics with whom you interact outside of the art world. Certainly, something like the Seagull Appreciation Unit, your talking to people, the public at large. But also, a lot of your work involves very heavy collaboration with scientists, park managers, archaeologists, and I mean, how do you approach these different relationships? I mean, do you approach these different audiences differently?
Well, I think, I mean, it's interesting because it can be very difficult because when you work with archaeologists or, say, biologists or conservation workers, they have a high degree of experience. They have a really very particular way of seeing what their practice is, and they clearly know that I am not an archaeologist or a wildlife biologist. And so, but at the same time, I'm really interested in manifesting aspects, kind of shadowing their methodologies in some way. But at the same time, I'm not using the scientific method. I'm not coming up with conclusions in the same way. But what is extremely interesting to me, which might not be at all interesting to them, is public perception, is how people understand what they do through a visual experience, which is something for many of them that's not really in their brief. So often I think what I do in terms of archaeology looks more like archaeology than what archaeologists actually do. And I never confuse the two, and I don't think they ever confuse the two. But for me, it's really productive to work collaboratively, and I work very well on kind of team building. I'm working right now on a project with an organization called Le Laboratoire in Paris, and there's one in Paris and there'll be one in Cambridge, and we're working on a project about jellyfish. About, right now that we have a problem, maybe some of you have noticed, we have a jellyfish issue around the world where there are increasing jellyfish blooms, largely as a result of the fact that we're kind of making an ocean that is extremely jellyfish friendly. All the things that we're doing to the ocean, which are causing all sorts of trouble, those things are actually good for jellyfish. So
because it's warmer?
It's warmer, so that helps jellyfish spread. We're also moving jellyfish around the world. So our jellyfish get caught up in the ballast water of ships here, and they end up in Tokyo Bay. That causes problems. We are, overfishing, so there's not a lot of things to eat jellyfish when jellyfish are zooplankton. Jellyfish are virtually immune to pollution. They're not affected by the toxicity that fish and invertebrates are. Jellyfish are immune to ocean acidification. They have no hard parts, so they can't be affected like corals or arthropods. So we're making this very pro-jellyfish sea, and we're seeing results of that with just crazy jellyfish blooms in places, and Greek fishermen not being able to catch anything but jellyfish because that's all there is there. And so the problem with that, of course, is that jellyfish are voracious. They eat everything, and so they eat fish eggs, they eat zooplankton, they eat phytoplankton. So this is potentially a cascading issue. And of course, jellyfish, close beaches. There are many jellyfish that sting. So I'm working with this team at Harvard and in Paris to figure out what are some jellyfish management solutions. There are some. One solution, of course, is the old if you can't beat 'em, eat 'em solution. To see if we could come up with dietary ways to make harvesting jellyfish make sense. One solution.
Seems like a hard sell, that one.
Jellyfish are, they're 95% water, so they're not the most efficient thing to harvest and use. But in that 5%, a big part of that 5% is collagen, and there's a big shortage of collagen for medical use, for burn, not just for plastic surgery, but for burns and other things too. So there's lots of, there are possibly products we could look at. So I mean, this is kind of quite interesting for me as an artist because we have, we're working with jellyfish biologists, with oceanographers, with ocean conservation people, as well as with young entrepreneurs who are looking for, they don't want to just solve the problem, they want to make money solving the problem. And then my issue is how do we make this visibly, aesthetically tangible for viewers? How can we make that into art? So these are really kind of interesting problems in a way. And when I work on something like this, I'm facing a different set of problems than I do, say, when I'm working with a gallery, where I get to do whatever I want. It just might not make any difference.
Well, going back to the question of fieldwork, it seems like essentially what it consists of is bridging these different worlds, these different constituents, the scientific community, the artistic community, and the public at large, et cetera. I think, and I think for me, we've come to, I think, a better understanding of the nature of your quote-unquote fieldwork.
Yeah, I think that idea of fieldwork is really about being in the world, right? And so that's an important aspect of a lot of these projects. And sometimes, it evolves to that, and sometimes it always starts from that, but sometimes it evolves back to being in the world.
Interesting. Great. Well, thank you.
Does anybody have any questions?
Alistair, yeah.
Please, sorry.
Mark, I've always wondered about your work, especially your field work. At what point do you start to become a professional? We know a lot about environmentalism, we know a lot about museology, and is it retaining an amateur status, and is there a point where you get to know too much that you kind of slip out of the artist category and almost verge into, kind of a professional role? Because you're getting to know as much as a lot of specialists in these fields now, and that must be a kind of an odd identity issue every once in a while. But is it
Interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, certainly there are cases in which I am really in a situation of mimicking an activity. Certainly no archaeologist would ever consider me an archaeologist in that way. I mean, I don't use the scientific method in that way, although, I do have, there are overlaps, but also what I'm finding, which I never really expected, is that people in those fields use my work as a pedagogic example. Sometimes a negative one, sometimes a very positive one. And, like working with, for instance, La Laboratoire right now, it's really interesting because they see me as an expert as much as they see Lisa Gershwin, the jellyfish biologist we're working with, as an expert, as much as they see the marine engineers we're working with as experts. So it's just what I'm an expert in is a little nebulous and a little tricky, and I'm an expert dilettante, and I don't want that. I know that term has so many negative connotations, but I really think if we go back to the history of the notion of the society of dilettante, right? That this group of people that includes people like Schiller and Goethe. This means people who are interested in everything.
Or at least in delight.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a really exciting notion for me.
Good answer.
Thank you.
I just want to say, a picture is still worth 1,000 words, and we all know that scientists typically can't communicate as to what they're thinking and what they're trying to do and what they're trying to solve. And you really do an enormous job by assisting them in making it available for communications to the public at large, and I think you're doing a great job of doing that.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's my job on the team. I like the idea of working in a team way. So that I often think about as my part in these teams. Well,
You gave us a little taste of the situation that you're dealing with, the jellyfish in France. Can you give us a little insight into what you've come up with as far as
how are we going to solve this? Well,
how are you going to?
Well, we're making a pretty sizable exhibition, right? So the first part of the exhibition, I want people to fall in love with jellyfish, right? Jellyfish are totally fascinating, they're beautiful, they're really interesting. So I want people to understand them as these complex, strange organisms, what they are, what they do. So then I want to have an encounter with actual jellyfish. I want people to be in a space with jellyfish. So tanks that have jellyfish, it's very complicated. And then I want to introduce, the problems of problem with jellyfish. So how do we articulate those? So one of those things is, another problem that I didn't mention is eutrophication, like of the dead zones in the ocean, places where there's no oxygen. So that's totally devastating for invertebrates and for fishes and for every other thing, except jellyfish can tolerate that more than anything else. So how do we have this experience of eutrophication? So the students at Harvard are working on a room which is a depleted oxygen room, where visitors go in and have an experience of what happens when you have less oxygen than you should. So we're trying to figure out ways to talk about these things in a very interesting, curious way.
Is it true that jellyfish can consume plastic? I read that somewhere.
I've never heard that.
Yeah.
That would be really interesting.
Or they maybe don't like it, but it doesn't kill them anyway.
But these, yeah, I haven't heard that. That's interesting. But we have, like, you know, I mean, there are also, you know, these great blooms of jellyfish are clogging up, intake valves for nuclear power plants. They're, they're docking nuclear submarines. They're tipping over trawlers because they fill with such weight that the entire ship sinks. So, like, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. So it sounds, I like it because it has a fantastical science fiction-like aspect to it, which is something that's always appealing to me. But at the same time, it's a real issue. It's very serious right now in the Mediterranean and in other places, in the Black Sea too. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Just very quick thank you again to One Well Harbour and also to Mark for overcoming our AV. Unfortunately, we did not have the bike he needed, but he did a phenomenal job. Rene, you were absolutely incredible, both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions from all of us after this, so do hang around. Thank you.
Thank you.